Welcome to another episode of Capital H. Today, we're joined by Girish Ganesan, Chief People Officer at S&P Global. In this conversation, we explore Girish's journey into people leadership, how the role of the Chief People Officer is evolving, and the future of the HR function in our world. Girish, thank you for joining us on Capital H and for sharing your insights today.
Kyle, thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. And Girish, I'd love to just start in the world of leadership at large. Being a people leader, being an executive has evolved in recent years. And so wanted to just have you share a little bit around what experiences or pivotal decisions in your career do you feel like helped prepare you for the role of being the Chief People Officer at S&P Global?
That's a great question, Kyle. It's been a range of experiences, some that I chose to lean into and others where I needed a nudge. I've been fortunate to have had roles and experiences across multiple HR domains, talent, rewards, operations, transformation, that gave me a more complete view of how the HR function and, more importantly, how organizations actually operate. And you begin to see that most business challenges are not isolated. They sit at the intersection of capability, structure, leadership, and execution. I naturally gravitated towards business-facing roles and thrived in areas like executive compensation, being an HR business partner, talent and learning. And then came a time when a former CHRO said to me, "You need to lift the curtain and go work in HR operations." And that experience changed my life. The breadth of experience matters as a chief people officer, and you rarely are solving isolated problems. And hence, being able to experience these multiple HR domains really sort of helped me as I prepared for this role. I would also say that my global experience played a significant role as well, like having lived and worked across US, Canada, India, Singapore, Hong Kong, and even the Philippines, taught me how to recalibrate and contextualize decisions. You can't assume what works in one environment will translate into another. And it really forces you to listen more closely and lead with greater awareness. The other thing, Kyle, I would say is that there are moments of adversity. Each crisis management exposure profoundly shaped my understanding of how you care for your employees. You learn that clarity and empathy are not trade-offs, and they have to show up together. Lastly, I would say is that through all of this, the pivotal experience has been about learning to lead through ambiguity. Every meaningful transformation comes with incomplete information. And the ability to move forward with clarity, even when you don't have all the answers, is something this role demands every day. And this is especially relevant as AI and digital capabilities begin to reshape work, where we still have a lot of unknowns. So in conclusion, I would say you don't prepare for this role by mastering just HR in isolation. You prepare by understanding how people decisions shape both business outcomes and also human experience.
Yeah, Girish, I appreciate what you shared there because I think that speaks to not only how the role of the Chief People Officer itself has changed, but just the expectations of being an executive in business, right? With some of the macro events that you noted that executives have had to navigate and have a clarity or a message to their workforce and their global workforce. In sharing those experiences, you've shared almost a journey of how executive leadership has evolved over the last period of time. But what I'd also love to hear, now that you've been in the Chief People Officer role, what are some of the things that you maybe intellectually knew or understood kind of going into the role you had heard from prior CHROs you work with or mentors in the field or others? And what have you seen from being in the seat, and how is the role evolving while you're in the seat?
When I took on this role and what I understood of this role has completely changed from what I would say I'm doing today. There are many parts of it that align with my understanding, but there are many parts of it that have completely changed to what my expectations and understanding were. And I say that because the role of the Chief People Officer is not just limited to human capital anymore. It's about unleashing the value of the workforce of the future, whether they are human or a bot. And Chief People Officers are expected to blend technological innovation while raising human capability. And I was trained in how HR was run traditionally, right? But the role now demands a blend of technical know-how, emotional intelligence, commercial acumen, and humanity in a world that is being reshaped by multiple disruptors. There were aspects of what I've talked about that certainly I grew up with, whether it's emotional intelligence, being close to the business, and having understanding of the business and commercial acumen, and certainly humanity. But technical know-how wasn't as explicit as is being required today. I would also say that the chief people officers are also uniquely positioned to enable organizations being led by responsible leaders more than ever. And because we are close to employee sentiments and trust in institutions will definitely be differentiating factors. And, trust and innovation can go hand in hand. So businesses that are viewed as both competent and ethical will be the employers of the choice. And chief people officers are central to that. Lastly, I see whether it's my role or my peers who are in similar roles in other organizations, they're being asked to rise to the occasion beyond traditional scope of initially what we expected off of the job. Whether it's crisis management to social impact, the role has become much more central to how the business performs and evolves. So the expectations are much more higher, including how we execute, and it's not enough just to run the HR function. You have to translate broader business outcomes that are more visible and measurable while still bringing sort of the traditional aspects of HR function that were always there and that will be foundation to, what the chief people officer role was always about.
I think even in the last 5 years, the expectations, I guess maybe 6 now, since COVID, put the function at many organizations in the spotlight, right? And what happened to businesses? They turned to the chief people officer, right? Same thing on the topic of AI automation right now. Many businesses are turning to the chief people officer and saying, help us navigate through this, which ties into everything that you shared about how are you in the seat navigating certain things and how are you showing up in the role. And one of the things I wanted to kind of bridge back into what you said earlier, you said you always try to be very intentional with being in roles that are business facing, right? And so in the seat of the chief people officer, in kind of the dynamic environment that we operate in, the many macro shifts that organizations are navigating, how do you ensure that not only the strategy for your function, but the talent strategy for the enterprise stays tightly aligned with business priorities?
Yeah, it comes down to that. Alignment comes from being part of how the business operates, not sitting alongside it. It's about staying closely connected to business priorities and focus on small number of outcomes that truly matter. In a complex organization, focus is a discipline. And through periods of change, particularly, clarity becomes even more important. People don't need perfect answers, they need direction. And that's where making sure that the overall talent strategy is closely aligned to where we are prioritizing capability building, leadership effectiveness, and also business outcomes is very important. To share at S&P Global, when we were gearing up for Investor Day last year, when our CEO, Martina Chung, wanted to talk about our new medium-term strategy, she was very clear with me that she wanted to have the workforce strategy be ready around the same time because we are in a people business, and she wanted to ensure that she's also able to talk about how are we bringing our people along as we mobilize this organization towards the next medium-term outlook and what we are committing to in terms of the growth of this organization. I think it comes down to that they are directly tied to how we grow and evolve as a business. And in particularly times of change, it is very important that the HR function brings clarity as to what's required from a workforce perspective in truly understanding how to drive business outcomes.
I appreciate that because, Girish, when I think about what I hear from chief people officers, HR leaders, et cetera, at the current moment in time and reflecting back on past waves of HR transformation, there have been times where the broader business has said, hey, HR, I feel like you transformed for the sake of HR. It didn't always deliver on business value, right? And you sharing this example, engaging with your CEO, right? I think that shows where navigating the current trends in the world of work, it always needs to be grounded on what is the business priority, what is the business strategy, and how is HR navigating, how's the people team navigating those trends to deliver on business value, right? Not something that just feels like it's for the sake of the function.
Completely. And Kyle, if I could also add that sometimes we blend functional strategy with workforce strategy. At S&P Global, I've been very intentional, and my team has been very intentional to have two separate focus areas as to what we need to do for the function, because also we don't want to be shoemakers' children, and we want to make sure we continue to keep up with the times. And that's our functional strategy, and we will deliver for ourselves. But the workforce strategy clearly speaks to how we are driving business outcomes. And part of that is having our own scorecard with clear metrics to show the business as to how we are making an impact. We have our own QBR to ensure that we have the same discipline as the business units do.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. I'd even maybe love to go there next, Girish, and see, can you share a little bit in your role right now as a chief people officer? What are some of the things that you're looking to shift within your people team? And, to your point, so that it's not like the cobbler's children, right? Like, what are some of the investments you're making in perhaps the capability development of the people, paired with where you might be making investments in AI and automation capabilities and tools so that the combination thereof is driving new capabilities, innovative ways of working, et cetera, for the broader organization?
Yeah, some of it is just making sure that we are also adopting what we're delivering for the rest of the organization. I'll give you a couple of examples here. So, a couple of years ago, about 2 years ago, we launched an internal Gen AI platform called Spark Assist. And as much as we were driving adoption in collaboration with our technology function with the rest of the workforce, my leadership team also leaned in to make sure we were driving adoption within the HR function. And I'm very proud to say our adoption of that Gen AI tool is probably one of the highest amongst the functions, close to about 70%. And that has included, we call them sparks, but they're really agents and prompts for both our function, but also for the employee experience of the 40,000 colleagues in 41 countries that we have across S&P Global. We, in tandem with this Gen AI platform, we also launched an AI Academy, and we made it mandatory across the organization. And part of that was also making sure that the HR function was also embracing all the learning assets that we were developing for the rest of the organization and putting them to practice. We have also been an ecosystem of test and learn before we deployed things to the rest of the organization, whether it is the next chapter of learning with role-based training that we are rolling out for AI, but also for human skills where we need to emphasize equally, and we call them power skills, because we truly believe, and I think many successful organizations that are focused on transformation are also doing this, where there needs to be a balance between both upskilling on AI skills, but also human skills that require the balance, particularly as you think about an AI human integrated environment. And we're making sure that we're embracing those programs within the people function as we're deploying them for the rest of the workforce. Second, in order to have more focused leadership from a transformation perspective, particularly in enhancing digital capabilities and automation, I created a new role 2 years ago, which was the global head of AI plus strategy for the people function, so that we had someone leaning in to design our own digital transformation roadmap, and we weren't necessarily distracted by having someone do that at the side of their desk. And since then, we have morphed our operating model even more so. And last year, we stood up as part of one of my direct reports, Global Head of Future Work and Workforce Planning, which is a much broader role than just AI. And that individual is looking at workforce strategy and workforce planning and future work much more broadly, given that there are multiple disruptors that we're dealing with as we sort of plan the next few years for our workforce at S&P Global. Beyond that, what I would say is within the HR function, once you have your workforce strategy and you translate that into the functional strategy, you have to be honest to yourself around what capability gaps that you have, whether it is reimagining incentives for future work or reimagining or reconditioning your culture. We have made deliberate investment either in upskilling our existing leaders or hiring from the outside where we knew we had capability gaps in order to take us into the future. And part of that is also making sure we hired some people from other parts of the organization, including technology, in order to bring those skills within the HR function. The last one I would say is that execution discipline that is required in order to make sure you can actually deliver on some of these promises. We stood up a program management office. As much as we had discipline in the past, we felt like given everything that was coming our way and the demands on this function, we needed much more sophisticated program management. And hence we instituted much more discipline in terms of QBR, prioritization, Because as much as the demands on the function are increasing, there's also expectation that we're going to continue to be efficient. And sometimes when you're running the function while changing the function, while delivering for the rest of the organization, prioritization is a muscle that you have to recondition yourself with, because you're not going to get more resources to be able to build the future while the demands of the function will continue to keep increasing.
Yeah. You shared, I feel like, so many good nuggets in that. I want to summarize a couple, and I'd love to ask you a couple follow-up questions. One, for folks, I hope they caught, you made it a priority to get a dedicated role to help with some of this, right? Not just a nights and weekends side of the desk focus of people, right? Because truly transforming the business, transforming, functions, workflows, et cetera, required focus, right? And secondly, then you had to identify, where do we have capability gaps? Let's not just expect that the people we have are going to be able to do everything we might hope they do. Where do we then make smart bets from investment to hire, build internally, combination thereof, et cetera? Oftentimes, people teams are pressured to keep headcount at a certain level. How did you go through navigating that decision to make that investment in the role and scope?
Yeah, you know what? Firstly, I'm very grateful to have an amazing leadership team that is completely aligned in how we want to evolve ourselves into a function that can lead future work for S&P Global. And part of that was just alignment across the team in terms of trade-offs. We self-funded the investment in new capabilities, and there were certain places where we felt like we could cut, and the other places we needed to invest. So I think leadership alignment in making sure that we were making collective decisions and what was right for the function was really the principle that we applied, and nothing else was needed from that perspective.
Which I think for folks in organizations where the environment and dynamic could be a little different, one of the things that's probably very telling, if I link that to certain things that Girish shared before, is the ability to always make sure that things are grounded in business priorities, the investment in a specific role, how it's going to help deliver business value in a way that's very clearly linked, right, to those business priorities.
This is where it's so important to understand how the view of leadership has evolved. And certainly, what has changed is the pace and the context, and leadership today requires a level of adaptability and humility that perhaps wasn't as visible before. And you're constantly learning in real time, and it's so important to ensure that you're involving your leadership team as part of that decision making, because if just the number of external factors that are going to disrupt in how work gets done. Earlier in my career, I used to feel that I had to be the most prepared person in the room and have answers to all the questions. But today I feel like it's more about leading with transparency. If you give people the why and the context, they tend to react much better. And similarly, if you instill trust in them in order to make collective decisions, you can actually bring them along and make tough calls, including trade-offs amongst your leadership team, because then they feel like they're part of it.
I love that, because I think in this moment in time, and as you acknowledged earlier, the volume of ambiguity executives on down to workers are navigating, feeling like you are involved in the conversation around trade-offs and considerations and the ability to kind of co-create, co-design what the future looks like is a powerful method of engaging people and getting them also excited about where this might go. So, Girish, the other thing I wanted to actually double click into a little bit more, you mentioned very specifically how you all think about skill investment, not only for the people team, but the workforce at large. And you talked about framing this in the terms of power skills, right? So how are you all balancing kind of investing in power skills, which might be things that are enduring, right? They're always going to be there, uniquely human capabilities, versus, let's say, technical skills or other skills in the market that might have a much shorter half-life or might be changing in terms of supply and demand in a more rapid fashion. How are you all navigating that?
We approach it as a balance, not a trade-off. We have to deliver for today while building for tomorrow. And that means investing in capabilities that matter now while also preparing for what's ahead. So at S&P Global, we've been focused on building these power skills, whether it's critical thinking, learning agility, growth mindset, and at the same time, investing heavily in AI, data, and digital capabilities. And what matters most is that these investments have to feel connected to real work. When people can see how learning helps them perform better today and prepares them for tomorrow, engagement follows. And underpinning all of this is a simple belief that leadership also has to role model curiosity. Because when leaders model curiosity and use some of these learnings and the tools that come with it, it creates momentum. And that's been really our philosophy behind the question that you just asked. But listen, we've had to build this muscle across not just the learning of 40,000 employees, but also the 7,000 people leaders that we have, right? So if people leaders haven't experienced how to drive this level of change, you can't expect them to just embrace it and create space for it. And some of this does require reconditioning. So we have made deliberate investments in a Change Leader Academy for all of our 7,000 people leaders. And they're going to go through this fall because leadership today does require a different muscle that can set us even a few years ahead. Because if you haven't experienced this before, you can be expected to drive that level of transformation and change, including creating space for building these new capabilities. And in addition to that, we've had to make other changes, and we're very thankful for the partnership with Deloitte, who helped us sort of set the stage on this as we were building the workforce strategy. As you know, we had to relook at our performance approach, which reinforced both outcomes and behaviors, but also how you're developing yourself. That sends a clear signal for what we value as an organization. In addition to that, culture is also shaped by how people feel like some of these learning investments can help them see the path forward in terms of growth and opportunity. That's why we're investing in a talent marketplace that gives people greater visibility into opportunities across the organization and also helps them believe in enterprise mindset through internal mobility based on all the upskilling investments that we are making. So long of the short is, this isn't one-dimensional. It requires intentional structural changes across programs, expectations, and behaviors. And leaders have to be able to prioritize that because that's what is going to help people think differently.
Yeah. Well, Girish, one of the things that I think is so powerful about what you just shared is that you all are making very intentional investments, not just in the realm of technology, AI, and automation, but in very specific people investments, like the Change Leader Academy that you noted and other things, so that as you think about how do you drive new capabilities, new behaviors, new innovative ways of working, you're both giving people the tools and then helping them learn to lead differently, learn to work differently, right? Not just leaving it up to random chance. And if I even think about what you shared earlier around your own leadership evolution, having lived and worked internationally in various countries, different roles you've been in, not every people leader will have been in those things, right? Or been exposed to certain crises that they've got to help navigate. And oftentimes that can lead to a wide variability in people leader capability, right? Because they just haven't lived through it. And you all are trying to make very intentional bets to, it sounds like, decrease the variability of the people leadership capabilities and thus have that much more impactful of a people leadership team, which ultimately delivers value to the organization and to your customers at large.
In a global hybrid organization like S&P Global, exactly to what you said, culture is experienced through how work gets done, performance is measured, how leaders behave, and how people are supported. And you can't rely on proximity anymore because context changes based on what people experience locally through their manager, but also in the location they're based off of, because there's so many cultural nuances in how people absorb all of the different practices across the organization. And that's why you have to be so intentional in where you want to lead consistently. And that requires some of these intentional programs and shifts and institutionalizing practices that I talked about. One other intentional shift we have made at S&P Global, which I do think is very important, and certainly in the context of our organization, because we do believe that to create a sustainable culture, particularly in times of uncertainty, not just through technical transformation that is ahead of us, but also all of the other disruptors, we actually stood up a well-being people resource group, because our principle is that we believe performance at scale is not just about output, it's about energy, and energy requires care. And I do think that is something that organizations should think about, because well-being in itself requires intentional practice within every organization, and that is not something that is being much talked about.
And Girish, if I think about all the science we continue to learn and accumulate around people, right? Neuroscience, psychology, other, the ability to link and help navigate people to lower stress, lowered stress can mean a happier, more rested, more productive employees. Happier, rested, more productive employees are driving business results. I appreciate you sharing that, because I think that's a really interesting, how can you take something and turn it into a competitive business edge that hopefully other organizations will also be following along and investing in. Well, Girish, final question for you. With all the nuggets you've shared, there are other organizations who are trying to navigate, right, everything going on in the world of work and make smart bets. What's one or two pieces of advice that you would share with them on how to think about everything and how to decide, hey, here's a good place for me to start relative to gaining wins, building credibility if that's something that their HR team needs to do, and ultimately driving business value?
Great question, Kyle. First I would say is that all of us are in this together, and there's no playbook to what we all are experiencing across industries, across organizations. But there's certain things that are consistent. Adoption of AI happens when people see relevance and feel supported and trust the process. So we at S&P Global have certainly focused on making AI practical and accessible. When people can see how it helps them do their work better, adoption becomes natural. So certainly to focus on that and making sure that people are being thoughtful about how to deploy AI and how to drive adoption, and also being thoughtful about transparency. As AI becomes more embedded, people want to understand how it's being used and where human judgment kicks in. So ultimately, it's not just about pushing tools, but it's about helping people feel confident about using them. And hence, we also made a deliberate shift in our employee value proposition from people first to people forward, because people forward is a momentum about bringing people along, so that we were being true to what we want to stand for as an organization. The other sort of tip that I would provide is that it's also very important that the goal is not about predicting the future here, but it's to build people who can evolve with it. We as leaders we're not going to have answers to all of the questions, but we can certainly provide clarity and confidence. So investment in people leaders is equally important as much as investment in learning for the entire workforce. And I don't think investment in people leaders, particularly middle managers and frontline managers, is being talked as much. So that is something that I would highly encourage organizations to focus on.
Awesome. I appreciate that. And I appreciate all the nuggets, Girish, that you shared along the way here, from talking about your own leadership journey, from some of the lessons you learned once you stepped into the chief people officer role, from how you've been thinking about investing in your function to evolve it, and also investing in the workforce more broadly. Folks, I hope you really take away some good insights and perspectives for your organizations on how you can navigate the moment. Girish, thank you again for joining and sharing your experience. And all of you Capital H listeners, we'll see you next time.
Kyle, thank you so much for having me. And certainly I'm learning as we go. So if other people have other tips and tricks that I can learn from, I would welcome any advice for both me and for the HR function at S&P Global. But thank you again for having me.
This podcast is produced by Deloitte. The views and opinions expressed by podcast speakers and guests are solely their own and do not reflect the opinions of Deloitte. This podcast provides general information only and is not intended to constitute advice or services of any kind. For additional information about Deloitte, please go to deloitte.com/about.